Europeans are going to interact with the American continents quite frequently in something referred to as the triangle trade. Now, we talked about the Navigation Acts um, restricting trade access to North America to only the English. So, raw materials in the North Americas are going to be sent over here to England. But there's also a trade between Northern and Central America, right? So you have the Central American islands sending enslaved people and sugar and molasses up into the northern industries. You also have enslaved Africans being sent into the English West Indies here and then the Spanish territories. And you can see that trade, it looks more like a parallelogram. And then European products are going to be used to get more enslaved Africans from African powerful empires. Things like gold, rum, those kinds of things are going to be used in that trade. So we have this triangle trade of North America, Europe, and Africa, which is going to increase the amount of enslaved Africans in North America and in Central America. And then it's going to continue to support that mercantilism system in between Europe and North America. Now, another thing that we need to mention about the colonies is the idea of the Great Awakening. In fact, it's called the First Great Awakening, which means there must be a second one later on. But the First Great Awakening is important because it's going to move away from government established churches and it's going to move to a more individual, emotional, spiritual revival rather than a government sponsored church, which is a pretty big difference from the Anglican Church, which was a government organization. Now, the impact that this is going to have is going to radicalize evangelicals, meaning a more internalized spirit. It's going to change the way people see religion in the United States, and it's going to emphasize the heart over the head. It's a move away from the Enlightenment. So there's this conflicting dual nature in the colonies between this religious, fiery, spiritual awakening and the Enlightenment. And you're going to see that conflict is going to play out throughout American history. We can also see in North America that the British are going to settle along the East Coast here, this green area. There's going to be a few Spanish people down here in Florida, but their main conflict is going to be with New France, right? Their main adversary is going to be between New France. Well, that and the Native Americans that are still living there. So as the Americans that are living here on the East Coast want to move into the West, they're going to find themselves being confronted by New France and the Native Americans. Remember the mercantilist system. We've already talked about this. It's enforced through the Navigation Acts. These are the colonies. This is New Francie area here. We're going to talk more about that proclamation line in just a minute. Please note that the colonies are there to increase the economic and political power of the mother country. So the reasons that the British North American colonies existed was to benefit England. The colonies send raw materials over, and then they buy finished products back. And this is enforced through the Navigation Acts. The British control the colonies. They control their trade. Although some Americans did smuggle, trying to get around the Navigation Acts, and it's fairly easy to do so. Some of the things that influenced the American colonists is the English idea of rights of Englishmen, two of them in particular, no taxation without representation, and the idea that they should be able to have a trial by jury. Remember, this comes from the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. They're influenced by John Locke and his theories in the Enlightenment, particularly the social contract theory. The social contract theory says that governments are created by the people, not by God. They were created by the people. The people consent to be governed. The government agrees to protect natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And if the government abuses that power, the people can overthrow the government and replace it. Now, as we move on, it's going to be helpful to understand the English system of government. The English have a king. Think of it as like the executive. They have different jobs, but think of this as kind of like the president. Secondly, is Parliament. Parliament is their legislative branch. The Parliament passes laws, approves taxation. Think of it as kind of like our modern day Congress. These are national governments. Now the thing is, the colonies were far away, and it was hard for the king and Parliament to really be controlling over those colonies. So the colonies developed something referred to as salutary neglect. They were left alone to govern themselves, and as long as they mostly followed the rules and as long as they were good citizens, they were mostly left alone. And because of this, they needed to have some way to govern themselves. So by the time of the American Revolution, every colony, all 13, had some form of a colonial assembly. Think of that as a self-government, right? Most of them are going to be based on some variation of a representative government. See, the colonists saw themselves as loyal British citizens. They just happened to live in America, so they wanted to be loyal British citizens, but they also needed to govern themselves. They're going to have royal governors by the time of the American Revolution, but those royal governors, while they are supposed to be there to enforce the king's rules, they're going to be paid by the colonial assemblies. So they're not going to do much that's going to make the colonial assemblies upset. By the time of the Revolution, all of the colonial assemblies had the power to elect people. And because these are the elected officials, the people have given them the ability to pass taxes. Parliament doesn't have any people representing the colonies there, so the people don't feel that Parliament can tax them. But the colonial assemblies do. So the colonial assemblies can tax the colonists. In 1756, and this is an important date, the French and Indian War starts. It actually started because the Americans over here went into the Ohio River Valley territory. There was a dispute. George Washington was involved. The war starts. We're not going to go too far into that. It is a war between Britain and France, triggered over the Ohio River Valley. But it's going to become one of the first worldwide wars. Now notice, there's a lot of France here, and there's not a lot of colonies. The colonies feel like they need to do something to protect themselves. They don't have a military. They're not even united, except for the fact that they're all British. There's a Congress that's called in Albany, right? These are just representatives from each of the 13 colonies show up to Albany, and they try to come up with some sort of plan. And you may have seen this flag before, right? And what it's saying is each one of these individual colonies, if they don't work together, they will die. This is about the French and Indian War, not the American Revolution. And this is a Ben Franklin political cartoon. Ben Franklin proposed something based on the Iroquois League in New York, which is a colonial area, North American area, called the Albany Plan of Union, arguing that if the colonies do not work together to fight the French, then they will certainly be defeated. It's a call for a centralized colonial government, and this is going to be rejected by both the colonial leaders because they have their individual assemblies. They don't want their power usurped by some British colonial united government, and the British leaders because they don't want the colonies to become too powerful that they think they might become independent. This French and Indian War quickly becomes a world war. They call it the 7 Years' War worldwide, but the United States, we still call it the French and Indian War because the United States was fighting the French and some Native Americans that sided with the French. Now, the British and the British allies win, but it takes a huge amount of debt in order for them to pull that off. Now, what does the British get for all of this warfare? Well, this is the world before. Notice New France and Louisiana. And this is the world after. All this green area is now British. This purple area is Spanish because the Spanish were allies of the British during the French and Indian War. Now, this red line is going to become very important because after the French and Indian War is over, the American colonists, the British people living in America, felt like they can now expand into what had previously been disputed French territory. But now they can move west. They can move from this area into these new territories. But the problem is that there's Native Americans still living there. They didn't like the Americans any more than they did prior. And when the Americans moved into that territory, the Native Americans attacked. One famous example of this is Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac is the name of a Native American that was leading one of these fights against the Americans who were moving into that territory. The British, for their part, realized that if the Americans move west, the Native Americans will attack. And if the Native Americans attack, the British Americans are going to want England to provide troops to protect them. And that's going to cost a lot of money. So rather than fund a military to stay in North America to defend Americans, they said, we're just going to draw a line called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And after 1763, Americans are not allowed to move west beyond that red line. This is the Appalachian Mountains. because they didn't want to pay for it. Now, the American colonists are still going to move across the mountains, but they're not supposed to. This is supposed to keep military costs down by the British not having to fight to defend the Americans. This is essentially the end of salutary neglect. The British have told the Americans, you cannot do this, and it's going to make the Americans feel mad. The British Parliament is going to go a step further. British Prime Minister George Grenville is going to seek to have the colonies pay off some of the war debt. His argument is that most of the French and Indian War took place in North America. It started in North America. There was a huge amount of debt accrued because of North America. So it's only fair that Americans who had not been paying any money in taxes to help out the military debts pay their fair share. So he passes the Sugar Act of 1764, which was designed to crack down on smuggling, to regulate the trade routes, and collect a small tax. This is going to lead to protest. The Americans protest to say that their jury rights are being taken away because these would be trials that would be put in an admiralty court, a court in the Navy. They also protest the idea of no taxation without representation, and eventually the Sugar Act is going to be mostly removed. Then in 1765, the British passed the Stamp Act. So the Stamp Act was a direct tax on American colonists, and the tax was going to be used to help pay off this war debt, and the Americans are going to protest. The Americans protest in three ways. The first way is a violent reaction, creation of the Sons of Liberty. They tarred and feathered tax collectors in response to this. The Sons of Liberty are also going to violently uphold a boycott, which is the second thing. The boycotts were an economic response. It's also referred to as a non-importation movement. The British created the colonies so that the colonies would buy British finished products. The Americans accounted for about a third of all British sales at the time of the Stamp Act. If you boycott British products, that's a third of the British sales that are going away. Now, in order to enforce this, in order to make sure that Americans did not buy British products, the Sons of Liberty there to beat up anybody that violated the boycott. Eventually, because of the boycott and because of the violent reaction, the British are going to remove the stamp tax. The Americans also had a Stamp Act Congress, which was a political response. Each one of the colonies went to send a representative to this colony, to this Congress. It had almost no impact, but it's an example of the colonies starting to unite together. The reaction to the Stamp Act was that the colonists protested. The reaction to the protest is that Parliament repeals the tax, takes the tax away. But at the same time, they passed the Declaratory Act. They declared that they have the right to tax whether the Americans agree or not. So we can tax you whenever we want, even if we're not going to right now. 2 years later, they passed the Townshend Acts. A new prime minister named Townshend comes in, wants to collect taxes to pay off the debt. He starts taxing paint, lead, tea, glass, a bunch of other things. This leads to more protest. Most of the taxes are repealed. This is about the same time that we have the Boston Massacre, referred to as the Bloody Massacre. Mr. Chapp will probably talk to you about this. This is a piece of propaganda created by Paul Revere. Right? This is a woodcut. Really makes up a lot of stuff about the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre is pretty complicated. A bunch of American colonists were surrounding a British storehouse where they had a bunch of gold. There's a lot of chaos. The Americans are throwing things, rocks, snowballs, threatening their moms. And in the chaos, somebody lets loose a shot, which leads to a volley of fire from the British. It is not an organized event like what is depicted here. This is propaganda, trying to get people to hate the British. And it's not really incredibly effective at the time. In fact, things calmed down after the Boston Massacre. There is bloodshed. A few Americans died. But the Boston Patriot, I believe it was Sam or John Adams, I forget which one, actually defended the British soldiers in court and got most of them acquitted. The crisis builds. There's the burning of the Gatsby. The Gatsby was a ship. This is the Boston Tea Party. The Gatsby was a British ship that was trying to enforce the Navigation Acts. It got caught up in a reef in Virginia. The people walked out to the reef and set it on fire. The Americans, because they see the tensions, start what's referred to as the Committees of Correspondence, where the leaders of the different colonies were writing letters to each other, trying to keep each other informed. And then in 1773, we have the thing that triggers the whole revolution, and that's the Tea Act of 1773. Now, the Tea Act is complicated because it actually lowered the price of tea. It's even more complicated than that, but we won't get into it. It lowers the price of tea, but it kept the tax on the tea. And colonists thought that this was going to be a trick to get them to pay a tax without representation, to prevent people from accidentally paying the tax and thus telling Britain that the Americans accepted the taxes without representation. These tea ships that were sent to the Americans were mostly turned away in all the ports except for Boston. And in Boston, the ship stayed in the harbor, refused to leave, and then the Americans are going to, led by the Sons of Liberty, go onto the ships with the tea, dump the tea overboard in protest of the tea tax. In response, the British are going to pass what are referred to in Britain as the Coercive Acts, because they're trying to force the Americans to behave. In the United States, they referred to them as the Intolerable Acts, because they could not be borne, they could not be bared. Now, there are four things that take place. One, the Boston harbor is closed until Boston can pay off for the dumped tea. If you ruin the economy, they can't pay the tea. Number two, the British took away the colonists' right to their own legislature, essentially saying, oh, you think you get representation and you can only be taxed with representation? Well, we're going to take away your representation altogether. Number three, government officials would stand trial in Britain, taking away the idea of the right to a trial by jury. And then fourth was the Quartering Act. Also, they included the idea of a writ of assistance, which was used to monitor the Sons of Liberty. Quartering is putting soldiers into private citizens' homes against their will. Writs of assistance were kind of like general search warrants that just gave the police the ability to walk into any house that they wanted in order to search. These are going to become important, essential elements of the American ideology, right? Taxation without representation, that's going to be written into the Constitution. Trial by jury is like the Sixth Amendment. The Quartering Act is the Third Amendment. The writ of assistance is the Fourth Amendment. These are important ideas in the United States. The Coercive Acts are going to lead to the First Continental Congress. The representatives from each colony are going to meet, I believe in Philadelphia or New York, I think it's Philadelphia. They're going to meet at this Continental Congress, and they're going to write up a series of complaints, a list of grievances that they're going to send to the king. The king largely ignores them. It's around this time that the Battle of Lexington and Concord is going to take place. So on April 19th, 1775, while the Intolerable Acts are still being enforced, while the United States is trying to get the king to listen to them, we have the first conflict of the Revolution. It's referred to as the shot heard around the world. The British heard that there were some weapons here in Concord, Massachusetts, so they're going to march from Boston to Concord. Along the way, they get to Lexington. Now, this is where you've heard the famous story about one if by land, two if by sea, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, which is mostly made up. But the Sons of Liberty did give warning to the people in Concord to move the weapons out of that territory. While the British are marching, Minutemen, farmers with guns, lined up at Lexington to try to stop the British from advancing to Concord. Now, they're going to meet at Lexington Square. And the Americans are going to stand there, and the British are going to stand there, and they wait for a little while, a couple hours, until somebody finally lets loose a volley. And the British respond. We don't know which side shot first, but somebody shoots, and then the British shot into the crowd. The farmers barely lasted one volley, and then they all ran away. But they held up the British long enough so that by the time the British got to Concord, all the weapons were gone, and they marched back to Boston. And on the way back to Boston, they're going to be shot by Americans hiding behind rocks and trees. And you know the story. About a third of the British that went to Concord are going to suffer some form of casualty, either death or injury. In response to this, the Second Continental Congress is called, and they write the Olive Branch Petition, begging the king's pardon for attacking British soldiers. And the king ignores it and sends more troops. The Second Continental Congress also established a Continental Army led by George Washington. What's important here is that George Washington was a Southerner. And because George Washington was a Southerner, that's going to get the South to be more interested in what's happening in those northern colonies where most of the conflict is taking place at this point. More British soldiers are sent. For about a year, there's going to be sporadic fighting throughout the colonies. A year later, after the Battle at Lexington and Concord, is when we get the Declaration of Independence. Now, this is the Declaration of Independence here. Most of the Declaration of Independence is a list of complaints. You can see the little hash marks here. Each one of these little hash marks is kind of a bullet point. They didn't write it out as a list. They just kind of wrote it in order. This first paragraph is what we think of when we think of the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Declaration of Independence is important for a number of different reasons. Number one, it is a document to convince unconvinced Americans why the king is bad. It's a piece of propaganda. It's trying to convince those people that are not yet patriots, but are not overly loyal to the king, to join up with a patriotic cause. Number two, it's important because it establishes some of the core principles that the United States is going to be built on. The idea of the right to the revolution, right? That if your rights are being denied, you can revolt against them. This is going to be the foundation of our election system. The idea that if you're not happy with the direction of the government, you can put a new one in. The social contract theory, the idea that government is created with the consent of the people. Now, we argue constantly about what the people means, but it is that idea that government is created by the people, for the people, and of the people. And the last part of that is the idea of natural rights. So the government is there to protect your natural rights, life, liberty, and what Jefferson says, the pursuit of happiness. And all of that is established up here. And also important is the idea that all men are created equal. Now, we know that in 1776, that's just not something that we can agree what they mean today. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776 while owning enslaved Africans. He obviously did not understand all men being created equal the way that we do. But what it does is it gives the United States this North Star, this direction that the United States wants to get to. And for the rest of our history, we are still trying to get to that idea of all men being created equal. We're going to see it in the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 when Elizabeth Cady Stanton is going to say all men and women are created equal. We're going to see it throughout the abolition movement. We're going to see it in the Reconstruction era with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We're going to see it in Booker T. Washington and I.D.B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois and their call for civil rights after Reconstruction. We're going to see it in the civil rights movement. We're even going to see it in 2022. All of this is still going on. The last 2/3 of this are the complaints against the king. They specifically target the king because one, it's an easy place to get people united, right? It's hard to say parliament. It's easier to blame everything on the king. And their government consists all of a Congress, which is equivalent to a parliament. So they want to make sure that it's the king, not parliament, that they're mad at. It's also important to notice that with the passage of the Declaration of Independence, the Americans have let go of the idea of salutary neglect. The dream was never independence. The dream was to go back to that time when they were loyal British citizens that were just left alone. They didn't initially want independence. They wanted to return to salutary neglect and have their rights as Englishmen protected. We're going to see this again when we start looking at the American Bill of Rights and see how similar they are to the English Bill of Rights.